Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtual Legality. I'm your host, Richard Hoeg, managing member of the Hoeg Law Business Law Firm of Northville, Michigan. And today we have a special Virtual Legality for you. It's a Virtual Legality Extra episode. If you're not familiar with that term, that's a video in which we don't really dive into the legalities of a situation, whether the statutes, the laws, the contracts, or what have you, or really even the business and economics of the situation. Instead, talking about things of interest that are in the video games field or in the pop culture field, but that don't really relate specifically to those legal situations. In this case, as you can see on the key art on your screen for Hogwarts Legacy, we're going to once again be talking about these questions of how game stories kind of filter across games journalism, the rules that games journalists appear to have on what is and isn't allowed in terms of thoughts that people have, in terms of YouTube channels that people run, and of course, the continued conversation of when it's okay to ask for somebody to be fired. Now, this all relates to a tweet that went out earlier this past weekend from Liam Robertson at Dr_Cupcakes. Now, Liam is somebody that has followed me really since I started this channel. I have followed him, and he's put some interesting stuff out there. Certainly a lot of stuff that I don't necessarily agree with, like I don't agree with what has happened with this particular set of tweets. But hopefully, since he follows me, he'll get a chance to check out my video and see exactly what I think is the problem. It's not all generated solely by him. He put out this tweet last weekend that said as follows: I know this is just shocking, but the lead designer of Hogwarts Legacy is Troy Leavitt, a far-right YouTuber who used to make anti-feminist and pro-Gamergate vids. And you can see a highlight of the various videos on this picture. We're going to take a look at the substance of this channel just a little bit. I went over about 4 or 5 of these videos to really kind of ascertain for myself whether something was far right, whether this was at all problematic, as a word you might hear on the internet. And I have my own thoughts on that, but that's almost a side story to the real conversation about how this kind of tweet and this kind of news is treated by the games journalism media on the whole. The second tweet Mr. Robertson brings up is, I want to make something clear here. I'm not trying to cancel anyone. I just wanted to let people know this because I feel like it's something people might like to know before deciding whether to support this project. This is all public info and there for anyone to find. Now, that is a thought that I am very sympathetic with. I don't want to cancel anyone, and I often am treating things in virtual legality that get many people very angry, whether that's CD Projekt or GameStop or Electronic Arts or corporate messaging on the whole. And I never want to get into these outrage mobs kind of concepts, but for this particular series of tweets, directed as it is, with this initial bit of sarcasm, I know this is just shocking, describing this channel as far right, I do question some of the motivation here, because the reaction was exactly as you would expect. Brianna Wu, as someone targeted by this channel, you should not buy this game, period. Kotaku, Hogwarts Legacy, lead designer, used to run anti-social justice YouTube channel. ScreenRant, Hogwarts Legacy lead designer, has history of anti-social justice content. PC Gamer, lead designer, criticized for reactionary YouTube videos. Hogwarts Legacy's lead designer, used to run anti-feminist, anti-social justice YouTube channel. And GameRant, Hogwarts Legacy designer, draws criticism for past videos. This is only a sampling of how this has been treated in the last couple of days, going on this morning and across the internet, at least on my timelines on social media. And we need to talk about why that is. I don't think we need to assume that Liam Robertson is a bad faith actor here, although certainly he has his own opinions as to how this particular information presents. He goes on in this particular thread to comment very obviously negatively about Leavitt's In Defense of John Lasseter video. John Lasseter being the animation head at Pixar, who was ousted for sexually inappropriate contact with some of his subordinates. I think was rehired by somewhere else and is currently working on films in a different capacity. But that's all well and good. Liam Robertson at Dr. Cupcakes is perfectly within his rights to have his own opinion, but foreseeable consequences are not unintended, and it was always going to be the case that this was going to be treated in games journalism the way that we are seeing it treated today. That's why you actually have the initial defensive tweet from Mr. Robertson that says, I'm not trying to cancel anyone. I don't want to be seen as someone that's trying to get someone fired, even though that was inevitably going to be the case. Let's take a look at how Kotaku treated this first. Troy Leavitt is a lead designer at Warner Brothers development studio Avalanche Software, currently working on controversial Harry Potter game Hogwarts Legacy. Now, that's a heck of an opening line, right? Why is Harry Potter's game Hogwarts Legacy controversial, you might ask? And of course, the article is going to go on about why it is so controversial, especially about J.K. Rowling's previous comments. But if you didn't know any of that, you might think that there was something really at issue with the game itself, when of course there isn't. Nobody knows anything about the game. We've got a reveal trailer and then basically silence. So it's a reveal trailer that looks pretty darn cool. In fact, I said, wow, Hogwarts Legacy is a stunner in September of last year, because I think it absolutely looks fantastic. But we don't know anything else about it other than the fact that J.K. Rowling is, of course, the author of the Harry Potter verse. Kotaku continues by describing what's on this channel. An accompanying screenshot shows a small portion of Leavitt's YouTube channel with video titles such as The Injustice of Social Justice, In Praise of Cultural Appropriation, and Are Thought Crimes Becoming Real? Right-wing commentators often use the book's authoritarian Big Brother government, 1984's, as a comparison point in their criticism, likening the fictional surveillance state to real-world equality movements. Now, 1984 is overused. I don't know that anybody disagrees with that opinion, but if you do, leave a comment to this video. But so many more people than just right-wing commentators use 1984 and use Big Brother as a reference point to an overpowerful state, or an overpowerful entity, really, of any kind. In fact, I would be more inclined to describe using Big Brother too much as a concept as really more of a libertarian thrust than a far-right or right-wing one, but maybe we are skinning the onion too thinly. Either way, before we get into the contents of this channel, this is expressing some of the concerns that I have with how a notion like this, that someone has a YouTube channel with ideas that I disagree with, is presented in video games journalism. You don't have to agree with one thing that Troy Leavitt says to not be a little bit concerned that the fact that he said it now suggests that maybe his game shouldn't be purchased or you should see him fired. Among Leavitt's other videos are lengthy defenses of both John Lasseter and Nolan Bushnell, the Atari co-founder who Kotaku's reporting found to have fostered a toxic work environment for women. In fact, Kotaku's reporting is really the only reporting that I could find in doing research for this video that suggested that toxic work environment. In fact, there's a number of other articles that suggest that wasn't the case. And again, I'm not making this video to tell you Kotaku's right or Kotaku's wrong, or the people that put other articles up are right or wrong, but to suggest that the mere act of disagreeing with something is in and of itself bad is toxic. And I know that word gets a lot of use, but that is the true toxicity in the culture of video games journalism that I see it as it stands right now. We have to be able to have these disagreements, because disagreement is not only the spice of life, it's also how you figure out where you stand on important positions. In some of his videos, Kotaku continues, Leavitt expressed support for Gamergate, a movement that fostered harassment against women and other minorities in the gaming industry, and criticized Anita Sarkeesian's Tropes vs. Women series as an uninformed fringe position. Now, this is where Kotaku is putting its evidence. It's making its case that this particular individual is far right and worthy of condemnation. And what I see here is a description of Gamergate that I didn't participate in, and I only know enough to be dangerous insofar as many, many, many people have their own opinions on that particular movement and leave them for me in comments to my videos and in DMs on my social media. I do think it is apparent that some people in the Gamergate movement fostered harassment, and obviously that is to be derided and condemned. But the Gamergate public position about talking about games journalism, ethics in it, how things are reported, the connections between people, the cliques that exist, is obviously, as I make this video in Virtual Legality, something that I think is worthwhile of consideration. Now, I'm not a member of Gamergate. I didn't even know it existed when it happened a number of years ago. But much like other things that you see me discuss in Virtual Legality, it's also why I don't really side up with groups and names and hashtags, because you just don't know what every individual and every portion of that group is going to do unless you control it. As for Anita Sarkeesian's Tropes vs. Women series, uninformed fringe position is an opinion. It's an opinion you can agree with or you can disagree with. Certainly there are a number of people out there that disagree with Anita Sarkeesian's description of video games. Certainly when I watched her when she was first coming out with some of this stuff, I found some of her positions to be entirely incorrect with how I interfaced with video games and my experiences in playing them. But just because I think that some of her positions are entirely incorrect doesn't mean I don't think that I should be canceled from talking about these particular issues. So we already have a problem with what Kotaku is trying to establish, which is that this person, that this YouTube channel from years and years and years ago is worthy of news today and worthy of your taking an interest in it. And what's even more kind of surprising about this is that this was public all along. While the channel hasn't been active recently, Leavitt's Twitter profile still links to it, alongside his status as a Hogwarts Legacy developer. This tweet from this weekend wasn't a surprise. It certainly isn't news. It's not the same kind of conversation that folks might be having about, say, Gina Carano and her firing from The Mandalorian, where at least in that case, she had made a post contemporaneous to her firing that people can agree with or disagree with, and there's certainly culture warriors on both sides doing that at length in my timeline and elsewhere on social media, but at least it was news and related to something that had happened at the time. This is far more akin to going back in James Gunn's tweets, finding things you found objectionable and getting him fired from Guardians of the Galaxy 3. And reasonable minds can differ as to whether one or both of those is appropriate, but I think on a sliding scale, a firing contemporaneous to an act is necessarily more reasonable than a firing or a news article or a series of news articles coming out about something that is 3 years old that was in all cases at all times public. So when we talk about these things, it's important to kind of get this nuance, to discuss all aspects of it. And Kotaku is very bad at nuance. In describing the controversies that surrounded Hogwarts Legacy, one of the things they keep bringing up, and they brought it up a number of times, I think I commented on Twitter when it happened, is the fact that Warner Brothers Interactive Entertainment, what we usually think of as WB Games, President David Haddad reportedly told employees during a private question and answer session that Rowling was entitled to express her personal opinion on social media. Kotaku uses that line in a number of places, in a number of their articles, as a kind of silver bullet. Like, how could he possibly say such a thing? Like, J.K. Rowling is entitled to express her personal opinion, which, of course, is non-controversial to anybody in my sphere, in virtual legality, that says, yeah, she can express it, and we can disagree with it, and we can comment on it, but certainly no one should be suggesting that she shouldn't be allowed to have the opinions that she has. Many fans have expressed concerns over Leavitt's involvement with Hogwarts Legacy since his YouTube history came up a few days ago. Understand, this was public information well before a few days ago, spurred on by the controversies already surrounding the upcoming game. Several users on popular gaming forum ResetEra have asked moderators to ban Hogwarts Legacy discussion altogether due to both Rowling's influence on the franchise and Leavitt's work as a lead designer. Now, I almost didn't believe this. I'm a member of ResetEra. I'm also a member of NeoGAF, the former ResetEra stomping grounds. And while they can sometimes be overly political, it was a surprise to me to find out that they would consider banning discussion of a video game that doesn't exist yet based on a YouTube channel from years ago that may or may not express views that they agree or disagree with. But if you go to ResetEra, you actually get a message from an administrator, at least as marked on their own website, that says the staff is going to be talking over how to handle this game. For now, please try to keep discussion civil. We'll let everyone know once we've had a chance to have that talk. And to me, that's wildly surprising. This is a video game, first and foremost, that will be released, will be of interest to certain people. Certainly Harry Potter, in terms of the generation probably immediately following mine, is one of those keystone cultural events. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons why J.K. Rowling's comments have hurt so many people so badly, is that they love the actual art produced by J.K. Rowling so much, they have a little bit of difficulty judging the author separate from the work itself. And let's just say I've had a lot of experience doing that, right? I think anybody that's lived a certain amount of years knows that there's a significant difference between the art and the artist, and that you would have a very, very small pool of art to choose from if you only accepted art that was entirely created by people you agreed with on every single point. There's no question that I disagree with J.K. Rowling on a number of points, and I will just disagree with Troy Leavitt on a number of different points. But that doesn't mean that the art that comes out couldn't possibly be interesting and maybe even good. But that's part of the problem with this discussion. The other one that I wanted to actually discuss just in part is ScreenRant, that really goes out of its way to try to attack this particular individual. It has been revealed that the game's lead designer has a long-standing legacy of anti-social justice views, and now may be shifting consumer opinions on whether to pick up a copy of Legacy when it releases in 2022. His videos range from praising cultural appropriation, promoting putting the National Guard in schools, or shooting active school shooters who are almost always teenagers. I highlighted this one because it's amazing to me. I didn't find the video where he talks about shooting active school shooters, but the very word active in school shooters implies that they are actively shooting other kids. So putting them down, taking absolute legal action to prevent further murders and killings doesn't strike me as that controversial of a position. Certainly, if you find it controversial, leave a comment to this video. YouTube loves that for the algorithm. But shooting active school shooters, didn't know that many people actually disagreed with that. Obviously, downplaying the extensive sexual assault allegations levied against John Lasseter is one of those areas that has come up because Liam Robertson highlighted it and said that he's only highlighting it to talk about potential buyers that need to know these things. But this is the way this kind of stuff is reported. I think 24/7 actually here says the studio has explaining to do because they hired this person, and how dare they? And again, I don't think that I agree with maybe half of what Troy Leavitt says in his YouTube channel, maybe more, but that doesn't mean that he shouldn't have a job, especially if it's one that it appears that he's pretty good at. He made the Cars 2 video game, and Hogwarts Legacy does in fact look like a stunner. So let's talk about the substance here just a little bit. And again, with the caveat that to me, to my mind, this is almost separate from the conversation of whether or not people should be reacting this way to somebody that disagrees with them. There are so many people in the world that disagree with you that you shouldn't cut off your artistry. You shouldn't cut off what you're interested in buying solely because someone disagrees with you. Now, there are, of course, political positions, social positions, other positions that somebody can take that are so extreme that you should know about them immediately, that they are news, that maybe they do deserve a firing or bare minimum deserve mention, like this one. I got to tell you now, having looked through Mr. Leavitt's YouTube channel, having listened to a couple of his videos, I don't find this particular individual to be the far-right monster that he's portrayed as in games outlets in and of themselves. You see that he talks about violence in video games. He talks about Nolan Bushnell, as was described in the Kotaku article. He does some video impressions. He didn't like The Last Jedi. Who can blame him? Who can blame him? He looks at Black Mirror. He talks about Title II net neutrality. Now, net neutrality is one of those internet bugaboos. I will tell you that I've had conversations with people, especially in 2017, where I expressed my doubts that quote-unquote net neutrality, making the internet a public utility under FCC purview, was the right move. That I had my doubts that that would continue to support innovation around the internet. I had my doubts that removing net neutrality, that was only adopted in 2015, in 2017, would cause the end of the internet. Doubts that were borne out by the internet not, in fact, ending. Now, that might seem a far-right position to someone that hasn't really dived deeply into net neutrality, FCC, or FTC regulations, but for someone who has, I view both support and opposition to something like net neutrality as something that can be a reasoned position for an individual to take. And in fact, he seems to present such a reasoned position that you can disagree with without thinking that he shouldn't have his job or that you shouldn't buy the video game that he's making. Now, obviously, when you get down here, you get into some of the stuff that really raise the red flags for the Kotakus of the world. In particular, his most popular video here is a discussion of feminist frequency and Anita Sarkeesian, where he disagrees with her pretty much in the entirety. Now, he does that in a couple of places in these videos, but he also has an interview with what I understand to be a prominent feminist video game theorizer in Liana Kersner, not an individual who I was familiar with. I watched a little bit of that, and he seems to let her talk. He seems to be willing to engage in this battle of ideas that I espouse so frequently here in Virtual Legality. And every single video that I watched, and it isn't everything on this channel, so if you find something that is really, really bad, you can, of course, leave the comment. But everything that I watched showed an individual that was grappling with difficult ideas, coming to his own conclusions, espousing them on YouTube. And while I might disagree with some or all of them, this wasn't the kind of flaming rhetoric, this kind of super angry far-right incitement to violence kind of thing that people immediately assume when articles like the ones we talked about at the top of this video are written. Which leads me to the final bit that I want to converse with you on in this video. Last year, I did a series of videos that were talking about a kind of expose article that was done by a journalist named Sophia Narwitz, who a number of journalists in gaming industry don't like. And in fact, my saying her name will probably result in some more blocks on Twitter. But she did an article that was from a source that was talking about the fact that games journalism had cliques. And of course, I love my puns, so I put in the thumbnail, let's talk about sex. And then clickbait conspiracy in the follow-up when her source went live with an anonymous blog post talking about what this individual saw in video games journalism. In the RT article, I referred to a clique in the games media space, and here's exactly what I meant by that. When I referred to a clique, what I was referring to was a group of like-minded, high-profile games media members on social media that frequently use their social media status to dogpile, harass, or cancel people they disagree with through a variety of tactics. Quote tweeting and taking screenshots rather than just having a closed conversation being the main one, inadvertent or not. When the RT article was released, I was curious what the reaction would be. I was wary of being a source because I did not want people to go out and harass anyone, but to raise the question of, is there a lack of diverse thought in the mainstream media? To my surprise, and yes, there were bad actors, of course, a lot of people did in fact start asking the question if there were any openly, nobody should feel forced to out their politics, centrist or conservative writers at mainstream outlets. I've spent the last 72 hours digging through the reactions to the article as well as the responses to users asking that very question, and unfortunately, of the many, many people Sophia asked, no one knew or dismissed the question entirely. And this article, and the article that Ms. Narwitz put out there, was immediately dismissed by games journalism, and I will tell you that Sophia on Twitter has a very caustic approach to conversation, and I can understand people being put off by that. Certainly, it's not the way that I prefer to communicate with my viewers or my listeners, and I think that rubs some people the wrong way. But the point doesn't just dissolve because you don't like the messenger. And while that is in fact the case, that wasn't how the story was treated by games journalists. They said, oh, well, you know, the messenger is so bad that this isn't real. We have all these different ways of thinking, and yet it shouldn't be this big of a story for a games designer like Mr. Leavitt here to have a YouTube channel where, I have to be honest, his videos are relatively milquetoast. They aren't terribly controversial. They do represent a different side of the political spectrum, and one that you might disagree with adamantly. No one's taking that away from you. But the commentary is still deserved when so many people think that the fact that a person having these thoughts exists is worthy of headline news in so many different outlets. And yes, Hogwarts Legacy and Harry Potter in general is a uniquely positioned intellectual property for an issue of this type, and that obviously adds the fuel to these particular news stories going out there. But it's worth asking the question, if there aren't actually cliques, that there isn't a diversity of thought in the games media in and of itself, because if there were, presentations like Mr. Leavitt's here just wouldn't be that surprising, controversial, or of interest. Now, I stand entirely against ResetEra saying, let's not talk about this at all. Let's not talk about the game ever. I stand entirely against those outlets that seem to portray what I saw as far right or beyond the pale or not worthy of conversation and in fact worthy of having this person silenced and put out to pasture somewhere. I stand against those things because even though I might disagree with what Mr. Leavitt has to say, the only way you change minds is to have the conversation, to engage with the thoughts, show somebody why they're wrong, because reasonable minds can differ. And from everything that I saw from Mr. Leavitt, he has a reasoned mind. The stuff that he presented was reasonable, even though it might be wrong. And that's the second part of the saying we use in Virtual Legality. A lot of people still come in the comments to my videos and say, well, reasonable minds might be able to differ, but that's not a reasonable mind. And that's really not the point. Someone that disagrees with you, even adamantly, even that you think is entirely wrong, might still be acting reasonably, might still be acting on their own reason. And that conversation is still worth having outside of the far ends of the bell curve, the absolute extremists that won't listen to anything but the screeching and the gnashing of teeth. There is a wide swath of individuals that are worthy of consideration and worthy of convincing that they're wrong if you think they in fact are. Finally, as I mentioned in this video, there are so many people that I disagree with, that you disagree with, that make art that you might otherwise love. Not a single person on this earth shares every political position with you. And that's a good thing. That allows for society to advance. That allows us to better ourselves and to better inform ourselves as to what we even believe. I don't agree with what J.K. Rowling has said, maybe ever, but I do love Harry Potter. I certainly don't agree with anything that Neil Druckmann has said in the recent past, but I love The Last of Us Part 1 as one of my favorite games of all time. And last but not least, it's important to remember that these things aren't made as monoliths anyway, whether or not you like or love Troy Leavitt. Because if they were, what do you do with something like The Avengers, where you've got Chris Evans on one side and Chris Pratt on the other? These are people that by all accounts on social media and elsewhere are diametrically opposed on a political basis, but still made one of my favorite movies of all time. Separate the art, separate the artist. Yeah, kick extremists to the curb. We don't need them, but there's a wide swath of thought that might be not what you think, but still doesn't and shouldn't result in your needing to cancel someone, or that it should be so important to make their political thoughts headline news. This has been a Virtual Legality Extra for today. If you enjoyed this conversation, usually we're not talking about topics like this. Usually we're talking about the business and law of video games, music, movies, television, things that I know from my background in corporate law. And if you like that, consider supporting the channel at Patreon, Streamlabs, buying a shirt from the store, or if you don't want to do any of those things, just subscribing and telling your friends that this is a place where these conversations happen, that this is a place where reasonable minds can differ, and that there's a whole swath of people that can be reasonable on any side of any political or other type of issue. This has been Virtual Legality for today. Thank you so much for checking it out on YouTube if you watched it, and if you listened to it as a podcast, thank you so much for listening. I will catch you on the very next episode of Virtual Legality. Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.